chess.com viewers to this new and hopefully exciting series on crushing with the King's Gambit. So we're going to be basically looking at 5 videos in total on the very exciting romantic King's Gambit opening, an opening which I've actually played for most of my life. Probably one of the only grandmasters who still seems to get away with playing this occasionally. It's a fascinating opening. I mean, I expect every chess player knows about the King's Gambit, and really, I think it's the most romantic chess opening there is about. So it's something that I have to say has gone out of fashion a little bit recently because of the use of computers. But if we just, some of the games we're going to have a look at here demonstrate that it can still be a very powerful weapon. And, well, the King's Gambit's been played in some of these famous games that I'm sure a lot of viewers out there would have seen. So we had the Immortal game. It's really kind of classed as coffeehouse chess. White tries to sacrifice all his pieces, goes straight for the black king, and happy to give up pawns, happy to give up pieces as long as he gets an attack going. And the games I've picked here, just to let you know what these 5 videos are going to include, I've tried to pick 5 very exciting games, but I've also tried to pick 5 games which have some theme throughout them so that you can feel kind of brave enough to give the King's Gambit a go in the future. Now, the first 3 games in this video series are going to concentrate on the moves, the variation e4, e5. And now the King's Gambit is when white plays f4. And, well, if we just compare this to the Queen's Gambit is the same thing, but the other way around. The King's Gambit is a much more dangerous opening for both sides, because after this f4 move, the white king can sometimes be weak, but also white aims to get very good attack against the weak square on f7. So this is one of the key points in the King's Gambit. And indeed, this is one theme I've tried to concentrate on, attacking the f7 square. Now, the first 3 videos are all going to be based on the sequence of moves pawn takes f4, obviously the most critical choice. I will briefly talk about other options in one of the other videos later on, so you can jump forward to that if you wish to see what I recommend there. And now knight to f3. So the first 3 videos are on knight to f3. The last 2 videos in the series are on bishop to c4, which is a move I normally favor to play myself, bishop to c4. But recently I've just found some very exciting ideas with knight to f3. So this will probably be my choice in future games. Now, ex-Soviet player Bronstein, who is probably classified as one of the most imaginative grandmasters ever to grace the game of chess, basically said that you should play knight f3 to draw and bishop to c4 to win with white. Now, of course, this is based on very old theory. And what we're going to be taking a look at in the first 3 videos is the move g5 here. Now, this is a move that has meant to have refuted the King's Gambit with knight to f3. And Bobby Fischer actually said about g5, this is the refutation of the King's Gambit, this move g5. And to be honest, this is why a lot of people have stopped playing the King's Gambit, because of this move. So I'm not going to look at other options for white. I suggest that you can do that yourself instead of g5. I mean, just briefly, what you're trying to aim to achieve with the King's Gambit, it can be quite a positional opening as well as a romantic opening. If you can win back the pawn on f4, so if you can simply go pawn to d4 and bishop takes f4, you will have a lovely position. Why will you have a lovely position? Well, you will have 2 strong pawns in the center of the board, controlling the center. You will have nicely developed pieces. And later on, when you castle kingside, we come back to this theme of having this great f-file that you can attack along. So your basic idea in the King's Gambit is not just to go completely mad and checkmate your opponent's king, as we will see, this does occur, but your first positional idea is simply to go f4 and then to take back your pawn. If you can win the pawn, you'll be much better. That's why black should try to hang on to the pawn, the f4 pawn, by playing this move g5 often, because if he loses the pawn, white can only be better. Other things we're going to look at with this knight to f3 move is really, like I mentioned before, concentration on the f7 square. But against the move g5, which is what we're looking at, I'm recommending now the move knight to c3. Now, this is a move that was actually recommended to me by the German grandmaster Carsten Müller, who's quite well known for his endgames. And I'm using some of the ideas he approached me with here and told me about. So I have to thank Carsten Müller for some of the ideas. There's also a great book I should mention by John Shaw on the King's Gambit, which I should also mention I've used to take a lot of ideas from and develop. So Carsten Müller and John Shaw, thank you very much. But this move knight to c3, in my opinion, is the best way of meeting the move g5. Now, here there are a number of options. In this game, we're going to concentrate on the move g4, which looks like a very logical continuation, and black wants to play queen to h4 check next. So this is something I'm sure if you play this variation with your two knights developed, you will get over the board on a regular basis. Now, the game we're going to be taking a look at here is between Jesus Sepulveda. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I'm sure I've pronounced Jesus right. So we're taking Jesus on the white side. That can't be a bad thing. And on the black side, we have Prito Ignosaro. Again, pronunciation of the surname could be wrong, so I do apologize. But not two of the most well-known players. Apparently, the player on the white side, Jesus, is, I believe, a physics professor, maybe in Spain. But here he plays a phenomenally beautiful game. So as well as hopefully teaching you some theory here, I'm also going to be teaching you some how to attack, keeping this theme I've looked at in other videos, attacking brilliancy, and things you should be looking out for when hacking, attacking, going for your opponent's king. So all these themes are going to be looked at in this game. Now, g4 is the move we concentrate here. Now, what else can black play? Well, black can play stuff like bishop g7, d6, knight c6. All these moves are going to be looked at in the next game and the third game. Now, generally against each of these moves, if black doesn't play g4, you have two ways of playing. Now, one way is to go h4 and play in a completely crazy style. And then after g4, you plonk your f3 knight on g5. And then you go for the f7 pawn and you even sacrifice your knight on f7. So that's one very exciting way to play against, should I say, less critical lines in this position. Now, the other way you can play is simply to go d4 first, getting a big center, and then trying to break this pawn formation of f4 and g5 with a move g3. So this is maybe the more traditional way to play. If black doesn't do anything forcing, you can go d4 and g3. This is going to be our main recommended line. But anyway, after knight to c3, the critical move is g4. And here, well, there's some interesting options. I actually spent a lot of time in this position analyzing the move d4 here, simply sacrificing the knight on f3. And we're going to have a look at this theme a bit later on. But one of the ideas behind this romantic way of playing is that after queen takes f3, you are just trying to go bishop c4 and aim for f7. Even though you're a piece down, you can still get a very dangerous attack here. So this is something we'll look at in other variations. But in this particular line, after the move g4 here, the best move is knight to e5. And this sets up a deadly trick. Now, queen to h4 check, I'm sure is the move that most people will face here. This looks like the most dangerous move, clearly, to white. Just briefly, knight to c6 is quite interesting in this position. But then I suggest you can simply take on g4 with your knight. And after queen h4, your knight can drop back to f2. And now after bishop c5, it would look like on the surface, white is on serious trouble here because of the f2 pawn. But here you can actually play the breakout move d4. And after something like bishop takes d4, queen to f3. And this gives white a fine position. But I know that most people in this position after knight to e5 will go queen to h4 check. No doubt about it. Now, here you should reply with g3. Very interesting and exciting move. Of course, black should take the pawn on g3. Already a completely mad, unbalanced position here. And it looks like white's king is in serious trouble, but you'll get this kind of crazy position often in the King's Gambit. This is why the opening is so fun to play. And here you should play queen takes g4. And this is certainly the best way to play. Now, theoretically speaking, we're not going to spend, too much on the deep theoretical side, because I'm just going to give you a taster. And the lines I'm suggesting here, I've checked with the computer, they are fine for white. So I do want to give you a basic repertoire, but also show you some brilliant chess as well. But here, black has two choices. Now, the move that black played in the game was g2 check, a very logical choice, because black is going to win a rook on h1, but actually a mistake. Now, the best move here is queen takes g4. And here, this is slightly disappointing because the queen's exchanged, but it does seem that white is better after something like knight to g4. And now, let's say d5, creating a threat against the knight on g4. And now, knight to e3, I think, is the best move. Point being, if d4, we can come in with knight to b5. And now, after take on an e3, we take on c7. And we take on a8, and we get a very interesting position, but the computer quite likes white after d takes e3. So this is very interesting, but I'd be happy to play this with the white pieces. At the moment, white is material up. You just have to be a little bit careful about your knight on a8 here. But instead of this, I do think the most natural move after queen takes g4 is the move g2 check here. And this looks rather obvious, but in actual fact, it's a major mistake. And now after queen takes h4, black takes on h1 and makes a queen. So we've had a very amusing sort of trade there, where black's g-pawn has motored down the board. But in actual fact, this e-pawn has taken on f4, taken on g3, gone to g2, gone to h1, queen. So a really funny sequence of events for the pawn. And white has sacrificed the rook. Now, one thing you can't be afraid to do in the King's Gambit, you cannot be afraid to sacrifice pieces and pawns. If you're afraid of being a pawn down, sacrificing, I'm afraid you've picked the wrong opening. And you'll probably be suited to something a little bit more calming than the King's Gambit. On other hands, if you're a romantic attacking player who enjoys very interesting positions where you can go for your opponent's king gun blazing in Kowtow style, then this is the opening for you. And after white's next move, queen to h5, it seems that black is already on the verge of defeat. Now, the threat in this position is to simply go queen takes f7 check, and then queen takes f8 checkmate. How can black deal with this threat? In the game, black played bishop to d6, which may not be the best way of defending. Let's just very quickly have a look at some of the other options. Well, knight to h6 looks obvious. This knight defends the f7 square, but now we can develop and play a move that attacks the defender of f7. And even though we're rook down here, this position is just winning for white. For example, you could go knight to c6 or d6, doesn't matter too much. And now we just simply take on h6. Black cannot allow us to take on f7, so we should get rid of the knight. But then after queen takes e5 check, we're going to win the rook on h8 with a clearly winning position. So against knight to h6, the strong move d4 is certainly in white's favour. Now, probably the best way to defend here, there's a number of ways. For example, bishop to e7. Let's just have a look at this as well. This does try to get some defensive pieces around the black king. And now, if queen takes f7, we can't go queen to f8, checkmate. But here, there's a very beautiful line. And I think the best move here, in actual fact, is knight takes f7. And this keeps more threats in the position than simply taking our queen, because now we have a discovered check with our knight. One beautiful variation here, really beautiful variation, is knight to f6, which looks fairly logical. Black is attacking the queen. And now what can we play? Well, it's checkmate in 3 moves here. Forced checkmate. See if you can solve it. If you want to, pause the video very briefly. It's a checkmate we're going to see later on in the game. What do you start with? Knight to d6 check. Now, if king to f8, queen to f7 checkmate, the black king has to go to d8. And now this beautiful idea, smothered mate. If you still haven't seen the checkmate, take a timeout here. And now queen to e8 check. A beautiful move. And whatever black captures the queen with, you're going to play knight to f7, checkmate. So a very beautiful combination, that one. And that just shows some of the dangers that black has in this position. The combination of knight and queen attacking is simply too strong. So, well, let's have a look at the game, because the game was also very beautiful. And instead of bishop to e7, bishop to d6 was the move that was played. And now, well, you could take on f7 with the knight here. This is not such a bad move. Instead, white decided to go queen takes here. I mean, if knight takes here, it's slightly different than before, because the black king has the e7 squared to escape to. Obviously, it should still be very good for white, this position. But queen takes f7 check. This forces the issue. The king has to go to d8. And now, well, wait, I mean, another good tip here, when you're attacking and you have an attacking position, you have the initiative, one thing you often need to do is have the magic number of 3 pieces attacking. At the moment, you have the queen and knight attacking. So you need to look at other ways to bring your pieces into the game. Now, it strikes me that the black king on d8 is very weak on the dart squares. So if you can get your dart square bishop into the attack, that should be very strong. And here, d4 is the right way to play that. Preparing bishop g5 check and castles queenside. So Jesus is certainly playing a great game of chess here. And now knight to e7, and tries to defend against his check. But now, again, when you're attacking, you need to play with energy, especially when you're material down. And here you are a rook down because the black queen has taken your rook on h1. So if you start playing passively, or you start playing a little bit with not enough energy, your initiative is going to be diminished and you're going to run out of play. You might get into an ending and you might just be lost because you're material down. So here, bishop to g5, energetic move, creating more threats. And now knight to b on c6 was played, trying to give extra defense to the e7 square. Now, if rook to e8 here, trying to defend it another way, we can play knight to d5, increasing the pressure, energetic play here. And after some sequence like queen to e4 check, we can go bishop to e2. And now let's say black tries c6 here, trying to force his knight away. Well, there's a beautiful combination here. I don't know if you can see it. What is the best move? There's 2 great moves here, but one of the prettiest moves here is queen takes e7 check. Point being, if bishop takes e7, knight to f7, checkmate. And if rook takes e7, we can go knight to f7 check, take on d6, and then take everything. We're going to take every single piece, leading to a winning material advantage for us. So that was one very nice line. But we can see here that white has very good play for his rook. And let's now see how the game finished. So knight b c6. Remember, you're attacking. You need to play energetically. Now, what's the most energetic move here? Forwards, knight to d5. I mean, you could have played something like castles queenside, but again, the more energetically you can play, generally the better. And this creates threats of, well, first of all, taking on c6, removing a defender to e7, and then taking on e7 with a bishop. Have a look at that position, pause the video if you just want to check that yourself. So one idea is knight takes c6 and taken on e7. Okay, well, black tried to take on e4 check. White blocked the check. And here, black's in an awful amount of trouble here. What can he play? Well, if he takes on d5 with his queen, we simply win his queen. Queen takes d5 because of the pin on the king. So that's not a good idea. What other moves can he play? Well, if he goes something like bishop takes e5, we just go bishop takes e7 check, leading to checkmate, as hopefully you can see. So here, black joined in the fun and he played, I guess this one of the reasons I like this game, it reminds me of an old romantic game, maybe from, the 19th century, where one side gives up a rook, but the other side kind of joins in the fun and takes as many pieces as he can. And even maybe realizing he's going to lose the game, but he plays in this is a very romantic game, this one. And one of the things, if you're playing chess, the King's Gambit is the most romantic of openings. And you will get this kind of thing occasionally, this kind of game. And here, well, black played queen to h1 check. And after king to d2, he played queen takes a1. So now black is 2 rooks up. But there's 2 ways to force checkmate here. One is clearly much more beautiful than the other one. Now, I suppose the boring way to force checkmate here would be, well, is boring. Is that really, am I really allowed to say forcing checkmate is a boring thing to do? I don't know if that's terminology correct, because I'm sure whenever we force checkmate in our game of chess, we're never that bored. We're always quite happy. But the simple way to force checkmate here is to take away defender of the E7 knight. So simply by playing knight to C6 check. And then after black takes this, we take on E7 with check. And it's going to be checkmate next move. For example, king D7, knight to F6 checkmate. So that's one way of doing it, but there's a much more romantic in the style of the King's Gambit here. Can you see the checkmate? So I've pointed out knight takes C6 checkmate, but there's another move here which I have to admit is one of the most beautiful checkmates I've personally seen. Can you find the other checkmates in this position? Just pause the video if you need to do that here. Well, the checkmate is queen to E8 check. A completely ridiculous looking move. So it looks like black can take this queen with two pieces, the rook or the king. But if black takes with the rook, well, hopefully you can see what's going to happen then. If rook takes E8, we're just going to go knight to F7, smothered checkmate. Remember earlier we showed a similar theme to this. Black felt obliged to take with king on E8. So this is precisely what he did. King takes E8. And now, can you see the checkmate here? Checkmate in two moves, knight to F6 check, and wherever the king moves, it's going to be checkmate next move. If king to D8, knight to F7, a beautiful double knight checkmate. And if the king moves to F8, which I believe happened in the game, bishop to H6 checkmate. So there was certainly a touch of the holy in that game, and I think Jesus could well have been the son of God in that game. A beautiful game, and really one of the best King's Gambit games I've ever seen. Really nice attacking play, lovely sacrifices combined with aggressive, energetic play. When you play the King's Gambit, this is what you need to do. You need to play with energy. Let's just go over the important moments before we move on. Well, if you want to move on, hopefully you do, to the next video in this series. So the important moments were, after this knight to F3 move, we're concentrating on G5. My main suggestion here is knight to C3, the double knight development. If black doesn't play G4, we'll move on to that in the next game, have a look at possibilities there. If he does play G4, we can go forwards with our knight. Then after the very tempting queen H4 check, we simply block with G3. And if pawn takes pawn, we take on G4 with our queen. Happy to enter into a slightly better ending if queen takes queen. But if black plays the obvious G2 check, we have queen takes H4, and then queen to H5, ganging up on the S7 square, a square that is a very weak point in black's position. A very beautiful game, very beautiful finish, and a very good taster, I hope, for the King's Gambit. So hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please look at the other videos in this series. This is the second game in my series on the King's Gambit, attacking with the King's Gambit, hacking away with this most romantic of openings. In this game, we're going to take two players, again, maybe not two of the familiar players to everyone, familiar names anyway, but this game was another beautiful example of the King's Gambit in real fire on the board with the King's Gambit, a real great attacking game we're going to have a look at here. With the white side, we have Moswinski, and on the black side, we have San Losada. And again, this is quite important to us theoretically with our repertoire we're going to have a look at here, but also a beautiful game, a beautiful attacking game. And I'm going to give you some chances during this game to see if you can find the best moves as well. So as well as looking at King's Gambit, another lesson on attacking chess here. So the game actually started in a rather different move order to what we're going to be concentrating on. So the actual move order that we're picking with the King's Gambit is going to be f4, and now pawn takes f4, and knight to f3, g5. Can you remember the move you're supposed to play here? A lot of options. What do you play? Knight to c3. That's correct. You play this move here. A very useful move, this knight to c3 in the King's Gambit. The knight develops, and in some cases, it can come to the lovely d5 square. And now here, d6 is going to be the main position we're looking at. So this is where we're starting. And now h4 is the move we're going to first look at in this game. A very interesting and aggressive way to play. Now, the main idea behind this h4 move is after g4, which is really the only good way for black to cope with this. One thing black never wants to allow to happen is to, break up this pawn formation on g5 and f4 unless he has to. So this little push h4 can be a very interesting move. I mean, if black ever took on h4 with his pawn, then his pawn formation is quite disgusting here. And we don't even have to rush to recapture on h4. We could simply play in King's Gambit fashion. Hopefully from the first video, you remember one of the main things you should be aiming to do in the King's Gambit. Can you remember what that move was? There's a little hint I gave in the first video. Well, I think here, d4, controlling the center, and then we are going to eventually win this pawn on f4 back with, we've got rook takes h4, bishop takes f4, and we can even castle queenside at some point. We've got a very promising King's Gambit position here. So as a general rule for black never really wants to break up these pawns unless you can win material and try to hang on to it. So in this game, we're going to look at the move g4 instead of this move. So after h4 here, g4, and now knight to g5. Now, what is the idea behind white's play? Well, quite simply, white is going for a quick win, even if he has to sacrifice material. Given a chance, white would love to go bishop c4 and again home in on the weak f7 square. Now, if he's not able to home in on this, he's just going to sacrifice his knight on f7. So knight takes f7, followed by bishop c4, d4, attacking moves is what we're going to look at, exactly as Moswinski played in this game. Now, before we have a look at this, I should also mention another interesting way that white can play after a move like d6. Now, this is pretty much the same against d6, knight c6, and bishop g7. And this other interesting way of playing is simply by playing d4. And this may well be one of the best moves in the position. But you have to, again, be willing to sacrifice it. The point behind this move is after g4, I'm simply going to sacrifice my knight on f3. I'm going to let you take my knight and aim for quick play. So I'm just going for quick development with this d4 move. I want to put my bishop on c4. When you go g4, I want to take on f4. I want to get castle quickly. And at the right moment, I want to play g3. Now, g3 is also a very important move to remember. I mean, against most of black's options, I'm going to play g3 in the position. But d4 is another very interesting way of playing here. I mean, for example, if g4 here, I'm just going to leave my knight on f3. I'm simply going to go bishop takes f4. And after you take on f3, queen takes f3. Even though we've given up a whole piece, we have good development. This is typical romantic King's Gambit stuff. Our bishop's going to come to c4. We're going to castle queenside. We're going to go for some really brilliant attacking moves here. But again, in the next game, the next video in this series, we will concentrate on this more. Now, if black doesn't play g4 here, let's say he plays bishop to g7 or some other move, then the main move that you should play as white is g3 here. I mean, this immediately tries to create some tension on the king side. But okay, again, next video we'll concentrate with this kind of idea. In this video, we're mainly concentrating on white playing h4 instead of d4. And then you can pick which one you prefer when you've seen both videos. Or you can just sit back and enjoy a great attacking game here. So this is what we're really looking at. Now, so the move order played in the game was slightly different to this. Our move order, as I just mentioned, is f4, black takes on f4, knight to f3, g5, knight to c3, and etc. like this. The move order played in the game was quite peculiar, and I wouldn't pay too much attention to it because it might just confuse you. I'm just going to bring it up now for my own uses, but it actually transposed to the similar position via a completely different move order with g5 here. But hopefully, you know what to do from the move order recommended. And here, white played this h4 idea. Now, g4 was played. There's not really another good way for black to keep his pawn formation on the king side intact here. And this is important. I mean, we looked at what happens if he takes on h4. I mean, what if he plays h6 here? Well, simply here, you can take on g5, and he can't be captured back because his rook drops. So he can't keep his pawn formation together like that. And if he plays f6, well, that's a pretty ugly move to play because black's taking away the f6 square for his knight. He's opening up this diagonal towards his king, and generally it just looks very ugly for black. I mean, you could simply develop with d4 and bishop c4, this kind of idea here. I mean, if you wanted to go a bit crazy here, you could maybe even play a move like knight to d4. The point being your queen wants to come into the attack on h5. But f6 just looks like a bad move to me. So g4 is really the move that is critical here. And now white's whole idea is to go knight g5. The pawn on h4 supports this knight jump to g5. So this is the main idea behind this. And now, well, there's a couple of moves here. h6 is what was played in the main game. This is going to be what we're mainly concentrating on in this position here. Now, what other moves can be tried here? Well, knight to c6 is pretty much similar. We just simply go d4, threatening to take on f4. And as soon as h6 is played, we take on f7. And after the king takes, we take on f4. And again, typical King's Gambit idea. We sacrifice a piece to open up the f file towards the king. Our bishop's going to come to c4 towards the king. We're going to quickly castle. We're going to just attack, 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 attack. I mean, imagine when you play the King's Gambit, I think you have to go back and you have to imagine when this immortal game was played, and these guys used to sit in the coffee shops. Imagine you're Morphy. You've got to get in the role of a King's Gambit player. Put on your Morphy hat and just imagine you're Morphy. Imagine you're there, you're sipping your coffee, you've got a big crowd around your game. You've got to play flamboyant moves. You're going for the attack. Your opponent's trying to defend. And if you win, you get these gold coins thrown on the board. You've got to get in the role when you play the King's Gambit. And I'd tell you, I mean, it's certainly one of the most interesting openings around. So that's pretty similar, but let's stick with the game because it's the same kind of thing in the game. Now, h6 was played by Sans Losada, and this is the computer's first move as well. And here, white is pretty much committed to go forwards and to try to go for this 18th century attack. Knight takes f7, and now black has to take this piece, and instead of going bishop c4 check immediately, remember the threat, as Nimzovich said, is stronger than the execution in chess. So sometimes the threat of playing a move is much better, and here you just got to go for quick development, and d4 is always the move to play. We have a very bizarre position. Okay, white is a piece down, but the black king is clearly in a more dangerous position than the white king. White can aim to castle kingside or even queenside sometimes, and his bishops has lovely squares to develop to. c4 1, the other one taken on f4, attack, attack, attack. And here there's a number of options. The move played in the game was knight to f6. Now, I think the best move here, and a move that maybe puts a little bit of doubt on validity of white's opening, is f3. And this is a good defensive move because it aims to keep the f-file closed. I mean, let's say white now takes on f3. Well, okay, or bishop to e3. Black just tries to keep his pawn here so he can block the f-file. I mean, let's say after something like bishop e7, the computer actually gives here g takes f3, and after bishop takes h4, king d2. And computer thinks black's a little bit better, but it's still a very dangerous position for black here. I mean, it's equal on material except for the one piece, so it's not equal on material, but equal on pawns. Black is a piece up. But white's pieces seem to be coming in the game much quicker. Bishop to c4, queen coming to f1. You can even try pushing your f pawn. I mean, if something like bishop g5 here, then the f pawn starts rolling, and you have this big barricade of pawns coming straight up the board. So even here in a practical game, I think white has very good practical chances. But okay, f3 is probably the best move here, but it's not the move that was played. I mean, other moves, let's say black tries to run with his king, makes sense. Well, here we can just develop, and this is what happens in the game, and capture things. And after something like bishop to e7, just queen d2, we can allow black to capture on g5. And now we can just castle quickly, develop our last piece, something like bishop c4. And then this offers white, again, very good attacking chances here. I mean, another thing in these type of positions, you also, I'll give you a little hint here, it's a very good thing to do, is to think about what your opponent's trying to achieve. Don't just think about your own attacking forcing moves. Remember to spend a little bit of time out to think about what how your opponent can finish his development. And in this type of structure, if he always has his knights, king and rook, barricaded in on the king side here, you're basically playing a rook up. And here, you have to ask yourself, well, how does black ever develop his knight on g8? And because, I mean, if he ever tries to move it somewhere, let's say he goes knight to e7. Now we can just simply take on g5 with a checkmate attack coming up. Rook takes h8, and the black's position collapses. So even though we're a piece down, it's very hard for black to finish his development. And this is where some of the compensation lies in the position. Now let's just go back and follow what happened in the game, because black did play the very natural move here, knight to f6. And now white simply took on f4 with his bishop. And later on, this f-file is going to be extremely good attacking line for us. I mean, one simple idea for white here is bishop c4 check and castles when the rook enters the fray. Now, knight to h5 was played by black. Black goes for a counterattack against white's pieces. Again, I think a better move here would have been king g7, but still here, white has great compensation. I'd recommend first you finish your development and maybe castle, and then you've got ideas of e5 coming in. This e5 move is a good idea, but why not finish your development first? Okay, well, knight to h5 was played, and now white brought his pieces into the game. Bishop to c4 check. Now, king to g7 was played here. What other options does black have? Well, if bishop e6, we simply take on e6 and take on g4 with check, which is going to be very good for white, so we can't allow that. If king to e8, we can just finish our developments. Something like queen d2, defending our bishop. And if knight takes bishop, queen takes. Queen e7, for example. Probably castling queen side's best here. And now, after a move like king to d8, we have got as many pieces developed as we can. So we finished our development. We need to think of the next stage of attack. Our opponent's king is stuck in the middle of the board. We want to open up lines in the middle. How do we do that? Maybe you can, at home, can think what the best move for white is here. e5, blasting open at the middle of the board and using our piece development, our extra development. A good hint there, if you've got extra, more development than your opponent and you're trying to attack, your opponent's well behind in development, then a great way to attack is by just blasting the position open. Try to look at pawn breaks that achieve that. So here, instead of king to e8, black chose king g7. But now white simply castled. And this shows us how powerful this knight g5 takes f7 idea can be. One main idea is to bring our rook to f7 with check. So a very powerful position here. Black tries queen takes h4, trying to start a counterattack. Very logical move. Now, a much better defensive move here would have been rook to h7. And this is actually a very clever defensive move. With the idea of the king going to h8. But still here, it's clear white has very good attacking play. Instead, queen to h4 was played. Queen takes h4. And now white played a slight mistake here. White should have played the move queen to d3 here. And the idea of this is to stop g3 and queen to h2 check. And here the queen is very good because at some point when you play e5, the queen controls this diagonal. I mean, if g3 here, we have the lovely move bishop takes g3, leading to some fascinating positions. Maybe after knight takes g3, rook takes f7 check, king g6. Well, let's see what happens after the clever move rook to f3. Now black, again, like the game before in the first series of video, can try to take a rook on a1. Can you, the viewer here, find the quickest way to checkmate black in this position? Obviously, it should be very strong here because the king is exposed. Pause the video now and see if you can find the quickest way to checkmate. Remember to calculate all the way to the end. Well, the quickest way here is with e5 check. For example, king to g5, we take on g3, we check. And now, after king to h5, we have something like bishop f7 check, king h4, queen to e4 check, with checkmate on the next move. So again, if black tries to get a bit too greedy in these positions, he's going to be in trouble. But queen to d3 was a better move than white played, but still, the way white played was also very difficult for black to deal with. So instead of queen to d3, and now bishop to e3 was played in the game. And I mean, this is very logical because the rook is making room to come down to f7. Now, knight to c6 is played here. I mean, a much better defensive move here would have been rook to g8, with a king coming back to h8. Even though white could have taken this rook on g8, black has to try to make the h8 square available for his king. And if if rook to h7 here, well, then white's going to win the bishop on f8 with something like rook to f7 check, and this bishop is in serious trouble. So black still has some defensive chances, but after his next move, knight to c6, the position quickly collapsed. White played rook to f7 check. If the king goes to g8, you have discovered check with a rook, would be very strong. And after king g6, queen to f1 was played. A very nice move, trying to bring this queen into the game somewhere on the f-file, controlling the f-file. Another very strong move there would have been e5. Again, this comes back to the principle I said earlier. When you finish your developments and you're trying to attack your opponent's king, or if he's badly developed, you want to open up diagonals, open up lines. By playing e5, you open up this diagonal here. So that would have been a nice move. But queen to f1 was also good. Black in serious trouble here. Tried knight to g7, but now his position quickly collapsed after knight to d5. Again, energetic play. When you're playing the king's gambit, you rarely go backwards. Try to go forwards all the time. And now bishop to e6, but after rook to f6 check, black had to try king to h7. I mean, a nice checkmate here would have been king to h5. Can you see the checkmate in two moves here? White to play and force checkmate in two moves. Pause the video if you need to. Knight to f4 check, king g5, rook to g6 mate. So the king tried to go to h7, but now white can get some of his material back. Rook takes h6 check, and he wins the queen, and he goes on to win the game, quite simply here. I'll show the rest of the moves just for, he's a queen up, and the black king is still in danger. And here, knight to f6 check, with the point that after he takes on e6 and throws another check in, he simply takes a rook on h8. And he's won another rook. The knight is on pre here, and black's position is crumbling. He's now too many points down. So I thought that was a very nice attacking game, showing some of the power of this h4 move. Let's just go over the opening very quickly. So that was with pawn takes f4, the critical g5 move, which we're concentrating on. And now I'm recommending against this, you go for double knight developments. And after d6, which is played here, h4, trying to set up knight g5 and knight takes f7. In the next game, we're going to look at another option for white, which is set up with d4. And then you'll be thoroughly prepared against move g5. And hopefully you've enjoyed some of these sort of, I'm trying to whet your appetite with the King's Gambit here with some of these very interesting openings and games.
they all see that it's a lie. 'Cause we always give it one last try. Yeah, you've watched me break 1,000 times. Now I'm all alone, 'cause you never show. You say you will, but then you don't. That's how it goes. Don't wanna know. I'm turning off my mind so I get by. I just wanna be happy, happy tonight. In the morning, I'ma leave without giving a warning. I'ma leave without giving a. But every time we say goodbye, we all know that it's a lie. Now I'm all alone, 'cause you never show. You say you will, but then you don't. That's how it goes. Don't wanna know. Turning off my mind so I get by. I just wanna be happy, happy tonight. Happier tonight. Happier tonight. I just wanna be happy.
This is the third game in our video series on the King's Gambit and hacking away with the King's Gambit, destroying your opponents with this romantic opening. And I found some very interesting games, I think, to show you, which basically demonstrate the energy behind this opening. Now, I do think openings have their individual personalities. I mean, like the Berlin obviously has a very solid personality. The King's Gambit really has a rather outrageous kind of Don Quixote personality. It's a rather sort of romantic but yet slightly mad opening to play. And I found some games that really, I think, demonstrate the personality behind the opening. In this game, I'm going to be looking at two players. Again, maybe two players you haven't heard of, but I do like this game a lot. I think it's a really beautiful and great game. And the players we're going to use are Johan Verhoef and Mikkel Karlgren. So these, again, I haven't heard these players before this game, but in this game, Johan Verhoef with the white pieces plays a beautiful attacking game. So we get our critical position after f4, e takes f4, knight to f3, and I'm only concentrating on g5 for this these King's Gambit videos, because this is meant to be the refutation of knight to f3. It's Fischer's move. Fischer said this is the refutation of knight to f3. So I suggest there's lots of stuff out there on other moves, but none of the other moves are meant to give white too much worry. Again, if a simple thing to remember, if black doesn't play g5, you should be trying to continue with d4 and simply recapturing your pawn on f4. But g5 is the critical option. And here our move order is knight to c3. So the move order I'm recommending that you play is knight to c3 here. Then after bishop to g7, you could go for this idea of h4 and knight g5, which we looked at in the last game. But I'm also recommending this d4 move. And it's really up to you which move you decide to play. Now, d4 to me looks like a very good option. I mean, you've got both your knights developed, both your pawns developed. You'll probably just you want to go g3 next. When you've got this set up with your two knights out and your pawns in the center, your next move is g3. And this is one idea you're relying on. For example, let's say black plays d6. Now, you must really play g3. So as a rule, when you've got your knights developed and your pawns in the center, g3 is a very important move to play. And now, there are a number of ways black can deal with this, but g4 is meant to be the best way for black. I mean, really what you're trying to do in moves like h4 and g3, you're trying to destroy this pawn formation of f4 and g5. And once you destroy this pawn formation, you will have more open lines like on the f-file to attack along. So you're just trying to remove these strong pawns away from the position they're in. I mean, here, after the move g3, if black took on g3, well, there's a number of good moves here. I mean, for example, you could even consider going bishop takes g5 here, bring another piece into the game. Also, the simple pawn takes g3 would leave you with ample compensation, because now something like h6, bring your pieces in as quickly as possible, like bishop c4, maybe knight c6. And here you could even consider castling with threats against f7, this kind of idea. So after the move g3, black shouldn't really take this pawn. Now, if white's given a chance, you should take on f4 next move, and this would win your pawn back with quite a promising position. So the main move here is g4. Now, in the game, we look at this kind of idea where white just leaves his piece on f3 and takes on f4 with his bishop. Now, something you don't do is that you don't sacrifice your knight when you first play g3. So as a rule, you can sacrifice your knight on f3, but only if you haven't played g3. So the best move after this g4 move is simply to move your knight. Somewhere like knight to h4 is the most active. Remember, in the King's Gambit, always look at ways to go forwards. And this leaves the possibility of coming into f5. And now the main move here is f3, trying to keep this extra pawn, and white should now continue bishop to e3. This is a position that's been tested out in a lot of games in practice. Shulman has played this, the American Grandmaster Shulman, with white. Let me just talk about things you're trying to achieve with this position. Well, black is a pawn up. Now, what you're trying to achieve with white, you're trying to castle queenside. So you want to go queen d2, you want to castle your king queenside. So this is a very safe way to get your pieces developed. At some stage, your knight on h4 can hop into f5, a lovely square for the knight. Once your queen is on d2, you can also think about annoying black with bishop g5, this kind of idea. And a very important concept, these pawns on g4 and f3, you can try to break them up, and one critical way of doing that was with the move h3, a very important pawn break. But all in all, I think white has great compensation because of the central pawns here. I mean, let's just have a look at some more moves. For example, knight e7, queen d2. Let's say knight d7. This is what Shulman's opponent played against him. Now, castle queenside, following our normal development. Knight b6, bishop d3. Last white piece is developed. Bishop e6, and now this important plan of destroying this kingside pawn formation, h3. Black tried to keep it together, h5, and now lining the rook up against the black king. Knight came to c4. White simply took this off, and now played bishop to f4. A much better square for the bishop. He can try ideas of e5 here now with white. The knight can come to f5. And indeed, after queen d7, white did put his knight on f5. And I think we can see that white has a very good initiative here. Black is still not able, he hasn't managed to get his king castled. White has got his knight to f5. He's ready to destroy the pawns over here. And this is a very good initiative. So a rule in this position, if you go for the d4 move, which I think is, I'll be honest, a more theoretical sound idea. Let's say after bishop g7, d4, if black plays a move like d6, you've got both your knights developed, both your pawns in the center. So what you do next, you play g3. So remember this g3 idea, but only when you have your knights and pawns in the center. So this is what you're trying to achieve. Now, what happens if instead of d6 here, black plays g4 in this position? Well, now I think it's correct to sacrifice. And the line I'm going to look at here in this game is bishop takes f4. You can also sacrifice bishop c4 first, but the point with this is if something like pawn takes f3, queen takes f3. And this game is concentrating this kind of compensation for white here. White only has one pawn for the piece, but he has good development. He has pressure on the f-file. All this is often we're going for this pressure on the f-file against f7. He has chance to castle quickly. So in actual fact, it's very good compensation here. So let's go back to the game in question and see what happened. Now, they played a rather strange move order, should I say. Well, not strange, but here white played d4 first. I'm not recommending this move order. I'm recommending you play knight to c3 first. And only here can you decide, I mean, only now do you play d4. I think it's better having a knight on c3 than a pawn on d4. And I think this is quite important in some variations. I mean, for example, bishop g7. I mean, let's say against d6, you do the same thing. You go d4 here. And, well, if bishop g7, we have our knights and pawns in the center, so we go g3. And if black ever tries this g4 move, then we go for bishop takes f4. I mean, let's have a look at let's go through this a little bit more now and see this compensation. Let me prove to you that white has a great deal of compensation. For example, pawn takes f3, queen takes f3, knight to c6, naturally attacking d4. Now, there was a game played, which we're going to have a look at now, but this is a subline, not the main game, but it was played between two very good amateur players, where we're going to demonstrate white's play. I mean, castle queen side here is one way to keep the initiative going, but very quickly in this game, bishop b5 was played, developing as well. a6, white took this knight off, castle king side. And again, pressure on the f-file is all important. Queen e7 was played, and now a nice tactical move, bishop to g5. Trying to force the black queen away from the defense of f7. And once you have your queen and rook on the f-file like this bishop g5 move is a really powerful idea. I mean, black can't take on g5 because you take on f7 and then take on f8. And this would be devastating for white. So queen at e6 was played, and now here white's should have played rook on a to e1, with e5 coming next, with a phenomenally strong attacking position. For example, let's give some typical developing moves. e5. Again, this e5 move, we see it come up a lot in these videos, but normally only once white has developed every piece. And even though white's a piece down here, I think he has a great attacking idea. In this position, can you see a way for white to bring another piece into the attack? How should white look at weak squares in your opponent's position when you're trying to attack? So try to locate weak squares that your opponent has. Try to find a way to get your pieces in towards those weak squares. Well, I see a weak square on f6. So I try to bring my knight into that weak square. And if black finally gets castled, the knight comes into f6 with devastating effects. And after something like king to h8, now it's going to be completely winning for white. So that's just a little example of some play you can get in this line. But now let's go back to the main game, and we're going to see this in action again, this idea of just allowing black to take your piece on f3 whilst you build up the initiative. So in this game, after g5, knight to c3 is my recommended move order. Now, the move order actually went d4, bishop g7, knight c3. So it's similar, but just slightly different move order here. And now black played this g4 idea again. What happens if black does not play g4?
Do you remember how you held me then? Now you got me reaching out. And do you see you got me falling in more times than I can get out. Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, how long do I got to keep you, to keep you? Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, trying so hard not to keep you, to keep you. Times and I can't get out. Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, how long do I got to keep you, to keep you? Down in the deep of my mind, I crawl for you and you're always inside. Down in the deep of my mind, trying so hard not to keep you, to keep you.
to defeat the very strong player Tomaszewski, and this was a very good game, and it showed some brilliant understanding. You should play g3. If he plays knight to c6 in this position, you could even consider going pawn to d5 here. That's a pretty good option. But in general, if he doesn't go g4, you play g3. And if he does play g4, you sacrifice with bishop takes f4. Of course, you must be brave to play this, but come on, you're playing the King's Gambit. Remember, go back to the days of Morphy. You've got to morph into the great Morphy when you play the King's Gambit. You've got to be willing to throw your pieces away. You know, have a complete disrespect for your pieces when you play the King's Gambit. Have a smile on your face, you know, to say, have a piece. There you go. It doesn't matter. I'm going to checkmate your king. After all, shouldn't that be what chess is all about? Just go straight for your opponent's king. And with this early g4 idea, this is what I recommend you do. In the game between Verhoef and Kohlgren, it continued pawn takes f3, and now the queen came to f3, a typical attacking position here. And now, well, knight to c6 is quite logical, but and this is what was played, bishop to c4. Now, what other moves can be played here? Well, if bishop takes d4, a super greedy move, there's a number of ways you can play against this. I mean, bishop c4 itself is very good, just developing normally. I mean, another good move here, instead of bishop c4, is actually knight to b5, but bishop to c4, knight to b5. Okay, well, this is the other move. And this attacks f7, attacks the bishop. For example, if black defends against both those threats, you can now play bishop to e5, attacking the rook in the corner. And if f6, well, this is a little test for you guys. You're playing the King's Gambit. There's a number of tempting moves here. You're a piece down, whole piece down. Now, you need to play with energy in the King's Gambit. You need to get all your pieces like in harmony. It's very important in the King's Gambit. All your pieces need to be dancing together when you play the King's Gambit. How can you do that here? Bishop to c4. Threatening queen to h5 and queen f7. And, well, already black is in serious trouble. Queen to e7 looks like the only option. If we take on e5, queen f7 is mate. And after something like queen to e7, we can just play something like bishop takes c7. And black's king is in a mating net, or he's going to lose vicious material. For example, knight c6, check. And so this bishop takes d4 move is far too greedy. I mean, black should not be going for this bishop takes d4 move. I mean, knight to c6 was played in the game, much more logical move, just trying to bring the knight out. And when you're a piece up, or a good practical bit of advice if you're trying to defend is don't get over greedy, just concentrate on developing and getting your king castled. And now bishop to c4. So increasing the pressure against f7. Here, black went for knight takes d4. And this is where real action happens. Other moves, other moves can run into lots of danger as well. White can simply castle, or you may have a bishop takes f7 check here as well. But knight to d4 is critical. A test for you here. White to play, what should white do? Pause the video if you need to. Remember, you're trying to play energetic chess. You sacrifice one piece, you can't be afraid. Try to calculate a sequence of moves here that will give you a very strong attack. Bishop takes f7 check, and this is the way you go forwards. What's another piece? You've already given up one piece, hell to it. You might as well give up another piece. Have them all. Have all the pieces. And now king takes f7 was played, and the point behind white's play is this queen to h5 check. Black's king is in serious trouble here. Now, king to e6 looks like suicide after something like queen to d5 check. The black king's not going to last very long. So king to f8 is the only option. And now how can white increase the pressure? Point here, the f file is open. How can you increase the pressure? Castles. A lovely move here. And, well, black is in dire straits. Knight to f6 was played in the game. I'm going to give you another puzzle. If queen to e8 here, trying to exchange the queens off the board, which obviously would help black, it's white to play, and it's checkmate in one move here. Pause the video if you need to. Bishop to d6, checkmate. Double check, unleashing the rook and the bishop against black's king. So very strong idea. So queen to e8 is not possible. Knight to f6 was played. And now we use the f file here. Bishop to e5, using the pin on the knight. And this is an important factor. Now d6 was played in the game. And white simply, okay, d6 wasn't played because if it is, white simply takes on d4. And this knight on f6 is going to drop. For example, king g8, trying to get out of the pin, simply queen to h4, and white takes on f6 next move. White has another pin now, the pin on the queen. So d6 is too passive here. Black tried to go queen e8 here, swapping off queens, and now white's finished in brilliant style here. Verhoff finished with a flourish of brilliance, should I say here. Really nice finish. You can try to go for it yourself. Now, again, positions like this goes back to what I was saying. When you're trying to attack, you've got to play with the initiative energetically. You can't just sit back and, wait. You've got to just go for the energy, find the energy and find the most attacking moves. Look for checks, look for captures. And here, rook takes f6 was a great way to finish the game. Bishop takes f6 was played, and now the point behind white's last move, queen to h6 check. Only one way to avoid a very quick checkmate. That's king to g8. Now, simply queen takes f6. This very strong diagonal for the queen and bishop is looking good. And black desperately tried knight to f3 check. White could have played g takes f3, but then black has swapped the queens off. Of course, black is still probably losing there, but white's finished in style. And after queen takes e5, even though white's a rook down, after rook to f1, black resigned here because there's no way he can deal with the threats to his king. I mean, the immediate threat is queen to f7 or queen to f8, checkmate. Let's say black tries to defend against this with something along the lines of queen to e7. Well, there's options here, but probably one simple option is knight to d5, bringing our last piece in and attacking the queen. Black can go queen to c5 check, but we simply tuck our king on h1. And again, queen to f7 check is pretty much unstoppable here. I mean, king g7, we go queen f6, force the king back, and then queen f7. All looking pretty horrible. And if not queen e7 in the original position, what else can black play? Can he try queen e8? Well, again, even here, white has time to simply move his knight to d5. And even though black is a rook up, like I mentioned before, look at black's pieces. They've all gone to bed on the back rank here. None of them are looking happy. They may as well have stayed in bed in this game, and they're going to be there for the rest of the game. So a very nice game for white there, a nice attacking idea. Let's just go over the major points, theoretically, and we're concentrating on this g5 move. And now knight to c3 is what I'm suggesting. And after a move like d6 or bishop g7, we get both our pawns in the center. Now, as a rule here, if you're given a chance, if white is given a chance, he should play g3. So if black plays a passive move like d6, g3 is the way we want to play. And if black goes for g4, then we simply give our piece on f3 and we get everything attacking, everything lined up against black's position, and we have to look out for energetic moves like bishop to s7, exactly like Johann Furhoff did in this game, and another lovely attacking game to finish our series of knight to f3. In the next two games in this King's Gambit series, I'm going to look at white's other option earlier on, and that is the move bishop to c4. So I hope you enjoyed the ideas with knight to f3, g5, and I really hope that's kind of whet your appetite to play the King's Gambit with knight to f3 in future. I can't wait myself to give this opening a try. This is the fourth game in my series on the King's Gambit, hacking away with the King's Gambit, or caveman chess with the King's Gambit could be another expression. If you don't know what caveman chess is, it's basically crazy chess that only a caveman could probably get away with. In this video, we're now going to move on to, on move 3 for white, the move bishop to c4. Now, in the last 3 videos, we concentrated on the King's Gambit accepted, where black takes on f4, and here white playing knight to f3, and then black playing g5. And we looked at some very exciting games there. Now, I just want to give you a quick lowdown on this bishop to c4 move. And these 2 next videos, I'm giving you a very sort of introduction to the bishop c4 King's Gambit. And I'm hopefully going to give you pretty much everything you need to have in order to play this move, bishop to c4. Now, Bronstein commentated on this move that this is the way to play for a win. And in recent years, it seems that players such as Nigel Short, Morozevich, and other players who play the King's Gambit prefer the move bishop to c4. And it's probably because of the reason that after knight to f3, g5 is considered good for black, even though I've given some very interesting ideas for white in that variation. So bishop to c4 is a very interesting way to play. One of the main bonuses this move has over delaying the knight's development is that you do not run into the idea g5, g4, because your knight can stay at home on g1. I mean, on the downside, you can sometimes get hit by the queen to h4 check move when you have to move your king. And this might look a bit strange to a lot of people who first look at this position, and we'll come on to this more in the next game where I concentrate on queen to h4 check. But this is not such a big worry, because when black has moved his queen to h4, it will also become a target to attack. So white can quickly go knight to f3, attacking the queen, and white gains a lot of tempo against the black queen. So it's not as worrying as people might first look. Now, also in the next game of this series, the last game of this series, we're going to have a look very quickly at other options black can play instead of accepting the King's Gambit. Not too much to worry about there, but I'm going to very quickly just show you some of those options. Now, this game was a game I played, and I was playing Grandmaster Jonathan Parker in the English League. I've actually got a score, I believe, of 9.5 out of 11 with the King's Gambit, and that includes... this is over the last two years or so, and that includes games against really good Grandmasters. So it really works extremely well for me. Now, in this game, Jonathan played knight to f6. Now, John Shaw, in his great book on the King's Gambit, has recommended knight to c6. Against this line, I recommend you play knight to f3, and now g5 is Shaw's recommendation. And here you have 2 ways to play. You can even go for d4, which is similar to what we looked at in the last game. The point being, after g4, we just take on f4. And after black takes on f3, we go queen takes f3, and we have a very dangerous attack here. One nice point in this position is that if black now grabs the pawn on d4, we do a similar tactic to what we saw in the last game. Can you remember that tactic? As soon as black takes his pawn on d4, very tempting. What can you play? Bishop takes f7 check. The point being, if king takes f7, queen to h5 check with a brilliant attacking position. For example, king g7, bishop e5 check. And now after knight to f6, white can simply take on d4. Pinning and winning. So that is a very nice line. So this is the kind of crazy caveman way of playing, and surely if you're playing the King's Gambit, this is the way that you want to play. So that's against John Shaw's like so-called refutation of this. I'm just going to go for, this is knight c6 after bishop c4. I'm recommending knight to f3 and d4. And if g4, just take on f4. If you want to play a little bit safer, you don't have to go d4 here. You could castle kingside. But again, if you want to play safe, you're really not playing the right opening, are you? You should go back to the Reti system or something equally as wet as that. I'm not saying it's bad. You know, people do like playing soft and wet chess sometimes, and including myself, but it's not in the spirit of the King's Gambit. And after castles, the point is, if white, against g4, you can simply move your knight back to e1, and this is about an equal position. You don't have to give up, sacrifice your knight. So that's against knight c6, what I play. I mean, most people here do play knight to f6. There's a major point here, and the major point is, well, it looks like e5 is a good move. But often when you have this knight on f6 and the white bishop on c4, e5 doesn't work because black can counterattack with d5. Now, I'm not going to look at this in any more depth because I know theoretically in a coordinate computer, this counterattack d5 is a very good response to black. So we are not going to play e5 here. But just bear that in mind in the positions that you could encounter here. Here we shouldn't play e5. That's not the correct way to play. This doesn't work here. You should instead just defend your e-pawn by knight to c3. And this develops and defends the pawn. And now the main line, the old main line here is with c6. The game, Jonathan Parker took a different route here. He played bishop to b4. And we'll come back to this in a minute. This is another line. But c6, let's just have a quick look at this first. Now, with this move, black is trying to take a stake in the center with d5. Against this, I think white should play d4 first, allowing the move d5. Then you should take on d5. And the best square for your bishop, I mean, one of the old main lines here was to check the king, but the bishop wasn't very well placed on b5. I think the bishop is much better placed simply tucked back on b3. And the reason behind this is that the pawn on d5, black's pawn on d5, can no longer be defended by another black pawn because black doesn't have a pawn on the c or e file, so it can't be defended that way. So the bishop will always have pressure against d5. That just looks like a good place for the bishop. Given a chance here, white will win back his pawn on f4 and get castled quickly. Now, the way I always play this position with white, this old main line, and I really have a lot of faith in this position for white. I think white's doing very well. I always place my knight on g1 on e2 here. I find this useful because it blocks any checks on the e file. And also, my knight on e2 can come into the game via f4 and then to d5. So this is the way I play. And let's just say bishop to d6 here. I always go knight to e2. And now there's a couple of moves. f3 is very popular. And if f3, I simply capture on f3. And after my opponent castles kingside, I no longer want to castle kingside here because I think my king's a little bit exposed now. I've had to take the f-pawn. But instead, I've had lots of gains, which continue bishop to g5. A very nice pin, and then queen d2 is coming next, and I castle queenside, where my king is perfectly safe, all my pieces attacking, and I'm not even a pawn down here. So this seems like a very good option. If black doesn't play f3, let's say he castles, well, now I castle kingside, and if I'm given a chance, I'll take back the pawn on f4, and if a move like g5, I now always try to chip away at my opponent's pawn structure. Hopefully, by looking at the previous videos in this section, you've got used to some of the ideas that you should play in the King's Gambit against different structures. And one of the main ideas against g5 is to chip away moves like h4, try to destroy this pawn formation. And I think this leads to very promising play. I mean, if black ever takes on h4, all our pieces fly in. Knight takes f4, and black's king is very weak here with white's dangerous. All of white's pieces are very dangerously placed. So that's the old main line for you. And it's quite simple. I don't want to overcomplicate things, really. I don't see the need to do that. But my opponent played bishop to b4 here. And again, I'm going to stick with a general rule with this bishop to c4 line. A lot of time, I like putting my knights on e2. And that's precisely what I played against Parker here. I simply wanted to put my knight on e2, so I could take on f4 with my knight here. And this looked like a very decent way to play in this position and a very good way to play in this position. So this was clearly the best way to play. There's a number of options here for black. I mean, if black doesn't do anything, I will just take the pawn back. And as we said in the first game of this series of videos in the King's Gambit, if white can ever win his pawn back on f4, then white should be better because of his pawn center. Now, my opponent, my very strong opponent, played knight takes e4 here. And this is probably the best way to play. And after this move, the point is if I take on e4, black plays d5 with a fork. But as we're playing the King's Gambit, the best way to answer such a move is by playing energetically and with development. So simply castling here. So I simply castled kingside. Point being, if my opponent now castled, looks very natural. Other moves he has available. Well, if he takes on c3, I would have played d takes c3. I know I'm 2 pawns down, but look at my opponent only has one piece developed, his bishop. And one typical continuation would be something like bishop to c5 check, king to h1. And now let's say my opponent castles. I can go bishop takes f4. I'm only 1 pawn down now, but I have pressure against the f7 square with my bishop and rook. And I have very good development. I have queen d5 as a threat. And if something like d6, well, this looks natural trying to develop. I mean, c6 would be a major error because now I could go bishop d6. And after something like bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, my opponent can never develop and I'm just going to be winning. I mean, for example, knight to a6, anyway, to try to get a piece out. I could even have the tactic, rook takes f7, rook takes f7, rook to f1, having double power on this f7 square. So that would have been a very nasty idea. And if something like d6 here, well, then I can just start bringing my pieces around towards his king side. Again, when you've developed all your pieces in chess, you're trying to improve your attacking position. Look at what pieces are not doing much. And here the knight on e2 is not actually doing much in this position, and just try to bring it into the attack. With knight to g3, I'm moving it either into h5 or to e4 with attacking possibilities against my opponent's king. So that all looks very promising, that line. And that's why my opponent decided to castle kingside here. Now I was able to take on f4 with my knight, and this is a good square for my knight. Again, if I took on e4, I'd always allow d5, but now I am threatening to take on e4 because I have control over the d5 square. And c6 was the move my opponent played. Clearly the best move. He's trying to go d5 again. Other options available? Well, if knight takes c3, we get a similar line to before. I take with a d pawn. I go king to h1. And let's say c6. Well, there's an amazing move, actually, a novelty I found in this position. I mean, my opponent wants to go d5. But a beautiful move in typical coffee house Morphy style here would be knight to d5, which should be a lovely idea. Point being, if my opponent takes the knight on d5, I go queen takes d5, and I'm attacking his bishop, and I'm attacking f7. And even though I'm a piece down, all my pieces are breaking through. And we've seen so often in the King's Gambit, the pressure against f7 is the main idea. And if something like queen to e7 here, I just bring a piece into the attack, bishop g5. And I have a winning position here. You can check this on your computers at home if you want, but the computers say it's winning for white. Black is too undeveloped here. It just shows you the dangers in this position, some of the things that can go wrong. So instead of that, after knight takes f4, c6 was played, and we'll just have a little look at the game very quickly now, the rest of it. I decided to take on e4, d5 was played, and now I went knight to f6 check. Again, when you're playing the King's Gambit, you have to get in the habit of looking at the moves that go forwards. And we can see by this knight to f6 check, my brain was only thinking in one standard way. Forwards, forwards, forwards. My opponent took here. Now the point of my play is knight takes d5. And I'm attacking his queen with my rook and the knight. If queen to d4 check, well, I'd play knight to e3. My opponent checked with a bishop. I simply move knight to d3. And okay, my opponent has basically survived the opening quite well, but after some simple developing moves, we quickly find that my position still has great potential, mainly because I have the two bishops. I have this bishop pair, which is very good. And if my dark squared bishop ever gets to this diagonal, it's going to be a great attacking piece. And after bishop e6, for that reason, I kept the bishops on the board. Bishop d3. Generally, when you have two bishops, and it is an open position, so the two bishops should be good, you should avoid exchanging a pair of bishops. And now my bishop did come to d2. I wasn't so worried about my opponent taking on b2 because it loses a lot of time for him. My opponent thought the same, so he developed. But now, again, I'm just playing as quickly, energetically as I can. And here, if my opponent took on this square, well, I have moves now, even like queen to h5 here, increasing the pressure. My rook coming to e1, still attacking with my dangerous bishop pair here. My opponent clearly didn't like that, so he played queen g5. And this comes back to attacking play, something I mentioned before. When you are attacking, I clearly am attacking here with my bishops. Look at all your pieces, trying to work out the best potential squares for your pieces and try to move those pieces to those squares. So which piece can I move around to a more aggressive square here? Can you find the correct move? Rook to f3, trying to bring the rook to g3. And my rook did get to g3. I pushed my opponent's queen back and my queen came in the attack. And, well, the position got much worse for him. My last attacking piece came in, rook to f4, trying to bring it around to h4. Again, you've got to play in the spirit of the King's Gambit, even throughout the game. Attack, attack, attack. And after queen to f6, queen to f7, I simply took on c5 now, winning a pawn. And now I'm a pawn up with two bishops with the attack. And this should be good enough for a Grandmaster win. And indeed, after my h-pawn stormed up the board, we had a lot more moves, but eventually I managed to break through. You can see this g6 square is very strong. No rush in these type of positions. You can take your time, but I open up the diagonal even more with this break e5. My opponent actually resigned around here, and he had enough. He actually, well, I'm also attacking the bishop on c4, and he knew he had no chance here. Critical moments of that game. Well, this is with the other option you have in the King's Gambit of playing bishop to c4. Now, against this main line of knight to f6, we simply go knight to c3, developing. If c6, we go d4, and we looked at this. Against bishop to b4, then I always recommend, remember, in these bishop c4 lines, well, nearly always recommend you put your knight on e2. I don't recommend this if your opponent moves his queen out to h4 quickly. It wouldn't make any sense then because you want to attack that queen with knight to f3. But in most other lines, this knight to e2 move is good. Don't be in any rush to get your pawn back. I simply castled with speed here. Speed is much more important than material. There are lots of tricky lines my opponent could fall into. For example, here, if he takes on c3, we don't go with traditional values here, taken towards the center. It's much more important to open up our pieces because we're playing in gambit fashion. Development is key. And then we just have to go quickly, quick developments. And for example, if this moves c6, I hope someone out there watching this video is able to get this lovely knight to d5 novelty in their games. But anyway, interesting opening there. In the next game in this series, we'll conclude our series of the King's Gambit, some tasty games in the King's Gambit, and we conclude our material with this bishop c4 stuff. So hope you enjoyed that game. One more game to go, and let me know how you get on with your King's Gambit. I really interested to know if anyone's able to get this position, particularly on the board. This is the last game I'm going to look at in this mini-series on attacking with the King's Gambit. One of the most romantic of openings, and certainly an opening I love to play. Now, I'm actually going to tell you a bit of a joke here as well. I mean, what happened to me in a game, and it wasn't actually this game, but I had a friend, and, well, he can be a little bit naughty at times, should we say. And I was quite known at the time to be playing the King's Gambit. And he knew I had white, and we were talking about the opening the night before. And I have to say, he should definitely remain nameless, this friend of mine. And he knew I was going to play the King's Gambit the next day in a game. And what happened was, I sat down at the board against my opponents, and we got the position here on the board. I tried to lift my f-pawn here, but someone had glued my f-pawn to the board. Can you believe it or not? So I was sitting down at this tournament, and I'm sure you're not allowed to do this in tournaments. Do not try this at home. But I went to move my f-pawn. I pulled it up, and all the board went crazy. So he'd actually glued my f-pawn to the board. Very naughty of him. But this shows you how much I enjoy playing the King's Gambit. And in this game, my opponent was David Howe, and it was a very important game. And it was played in the British Championships, and we were both sort of up there at the top, and a win here would have maybe put me in a great position anyway to win the championships. And my opponent was David Howe, who's rated about 2650, very strong player from England, quite a young player still, so a lot of potential. And in this game, we're going to have a quick look, only a very brief look, at other options you might face. So a quick look at what happens after f4 if black doesn't take the pawn on f4. So we'll cover that quickly. And then we're going to go on to the main game. And in the main game, my opponent took on f4 and played a queen to h4 check very quickly. So this is what I want to look at, how to deal with a queen to h4 check. And I think a lot of people will face this in their games. But first of all, what should you do if your opponent does not capture on f4? And I let you know, this can only work if your friend has not superglued your pawn on f2 to the board. And he was quite lucky he didn't get thrown out the tournament, but I kept my mouth shut about this. Can you imagine, you're trying to sit there at a tournament, you're all prepped up, you go to pick up your pawn, and you lift up the whole board because it's attached to the board, and everyone looks at you, and you're completely confused, you've got no idea what's going on, and there's someone laughing in the background, so it's quite obvious who did it. But okay, after f4, what other options does black have here? Well, the main option is d5. This is a counter-attacking move. And here you have to be a little bit careful. You should always take on d5. Now, taking on e5 just loses the game immediately. And this is something you avoid doing at all costs in the King's Gambits. It should be pretty obvious why it loses. Look for checks, look for aggressive move black has. Queen to h4 check. And if g3, queen takes e4 check, winning a rook. Now, that would be a very embarrassing way to go home. So do not allow that move. So what you have to do in this position, instead of taking on e5 here, which should just lose, you have to always take on d5. And in this position, there's a number of options. The main move is taking on f4. This is rather shadowed out the main move. If black goes e4 here, and there's quite a lot to take in this video, lots of different systems. I mean, you kind of have to learn these ideas. So maybe play this video a couple of times if you're getting confused. Now here, you should play d3. Try to remove this pawn on e4 from your position, from your side as quickly as possible. The main line here is knight to f6. Now you should take on e4. And after knight takes e4, there's a couple of good moves here, but I like allowing my opponent to get his bishop to c5 here. And I'd rather be the one sacrificing. So bishop to e3 is my favorite move. Yes, this does allow queen to h4 check when we should block with g3. And black has to really take on g3. Now we flick in this move, knight to f3, first gaining a tempo on the queen. When the queen moves, I take this knight off, sacrificing the knight, and I go queen to e2. And this is getting ready for some discovered check with my bishop. Yes, I'm exchanged down, but I've got quick development here. Knight c3, castle's queenside, better development. My opponent's queen is out of the game on h1. So I really like this kind of position. So if we just go back, that is against the move e4 in this position. We just hit it with d3. Okay, well, after we take on d5, I mean, again, there are other options. c6 is something else we should be wary of. Again, you always have to be careful when you take the pawn on e5. This would again fall into the same trick. Queen to h4 check, and we're losing. So do not take the pawn on e5 here. Instead of taking this pawn on e5, we should just go knight to c3, which is the theoretical move. And this has a bonus. If we move knight to f3 in the last position, we get hit by e4. And here we are now threatening to take on e5 because our knight on c3 controls the e4 square. So c takes d5, and now we can take on e5. And after something like d4, our knight sits on e4. White's known to be slightly better here. Okay, and the only other real move that you need to know about in this variation, after d5, we take on d5, is the main move, and that is e takes f4. Here, I recommend you now stop the check on h4, so knight to f3, and now knight to f6 is the main move. It's preferable for black to take back on d5 a knight than the queen, because after queen takes d5, you simply go knight to c3, and white has quick development. In typical King's Gambit style, you want to go d4, take your pawn back, develop with speed. You do not need to worry about this variation. So knight to f6 is the main possibility. And here I'm going to recommend you go for a quick development line, quick castling, and this is the most dangerous of whites. Nakamura actually used this line to defeat Mickey Adams a couple of years ago. And the line I'm recommending you play here is bishop to c4. And this allows you to castle quickly. And after knight takes d5, I simply say you castle. And if bishop to e7, just d4. We want to maybe take the knight, take the pawn back on f4, or we could go knight to c3, quick developments. I mean, if black ever plays g5, I mean, this is one move, you know, black can play to hold on to this pawn. But you've got to be willing to be a pawn down in some positions. And one of the problems black will run into with g5 is that his king is going to be much weaker when it castles. And even here you have some aggressive move like knight to e5, allowing our queen to zoom over to h5. And don't forget, when your opponent has gone g5 and f4, you should also be looking at the moves g3 and h4 to destroy his pawn formation. Okay, well, that's really, I mean, a very, very quick lowdown of what you should be doing after d5. That you should simply take on d5, and then, depending on what black plays, go for quick developments. So what else can be played here as well as this d5 move? Well, bishop to c5 is very popular at the lower level and it's been recommended by a number of players in books. So I think I want to just concentrate on this for a minute as well. In this position, I'm going to suggest you simply develop with both your knights first. Then you try to put your bishop on c4. Then you play d3. And last, you put your knight on a4 to try to swap off this strong bishop. This is my simple development strategy. Develop your knights, put your bishop on c4, go d3, and then try to go knight to a4 to swap off the bishop on c5. Let's just see that in action, this plan. Knight to f3 first. Now black defends with pawn to d6, knight to c3. Let's say knight to s6, bishop c4, knight c6, d3. And if castles, knight to a4, swapping off this very powerful piece. And when you can swap that piece off, you can castle, which is a major benefit. Now, just quickly, if black ever tries knight g4 here, which a lot of players ask me about, what do I do with knight g4? Well, the standard response in this position is knight to g5. And this looks like a very good response often to face this move. You want to play something like attack f7. And if black now insists on playing knight to f2, which is an idea, trying to come for the queen and the rook, well, now all the white's pieces come flying into the attack. Queen to h5. And this is a good way to play. Just ganging up on the f7 square here. And if g6, well, you can take on f7 with a bishop. And okay, white's doing very well here. Again, a lot to take in, I know, but the one rule to remember, if your opponent plays the move knight to g4 in this position, you should play knight to g5. This is just the basic rule here. And really, that's, a quick lowdown to most of the moves you have to be worried about with the anti-lines. I mean, there's other moves that black can play, of course there is, but, a lot of the other moves that black can play are just not that good. I mean, d5 is the main move, and the other main option I'd say is this bishop to c5. So I think we'll just leave it there for now. Okay, so what about if this queen to h4 check idea? Well, black can play it in this position, or he can play it on his next move. Now, if black plays it in this position, we always put our king on f1. And now, a nice way to play this, I'm just going to tell you a plan which I like. I mean, of course, you can go for the standard knight to f3. Now, a way I try to play this position, we're going to see in the main line, I try to first go d4, and then I often continue with knight c3. I leave these pieces here, and then once I've gone d4, knight c3, I often go queen d2, just trying to win this pawn back. Remember, I mean, there was a great King's Gambit player, Joseph Gallagher from England, and he wrote a brilliant book on the King's Gambit, played it most of his life. And he once told me a little secret. He basically said, Simon, when you're playing the King's Gambit, you don't have to be scared to enter endings. In actual fact, a lot of the endings are going to be better for you because you have this central majority. So if you can win your pawn back and even enter into an ending, this can be very good for white. After king to f1. So, I mean, I like this plan. d4, knight c3, queen d2. And then a very interesting move, I often aim to play g3. When my opponent takes on g3, I often go king g2. I mean, again, let's see this in motion. Let's say d6 here, d4. Now, knight c6, for example, knight c3. And after a move like bishop g4 attacking my queen, I put my queen on d2. And if g5 here, defending the pawn, we transpose back into the main game with g3, which we'll come on to now. So against this queen h4 check, I basically recommend you go king f1, and then you can either go d4, knight c3, and we'll see this in action in the game. I mean, the move order is not so important. You can play knight to f3. This is another option, but I mean, I like d4, knight to c3 first. So what if d6? Well, against d6 here, we're now going d4, as I recommended. I mean, knight to f3 is something you could play, but the problem then is this g5 move, which we've looked at in the first 3 videos. I mean, you can go back into this kind of position because here you have the h4 possibility. And this is even stronger than some of the lines we looked at in the first, I think it was video 2 of this series, this h4 idea, because you have power on f7. So in actual fact, you can, if you want to stop queen h4, play knight to f3 here. But I'm not scared of this queen to h4 idea. So I always try to play d4 in this position. Okay, so now queen to h4 check. I always put my king on f1. And now knight to c6. I mean, there's loads of other moves that black can play. But against knight c6, I go knight to c3. And I'm still following my principle of just trying to win the pawn back on f4 or going g3. But let's see this very important g3 move in action. Okay, bishop g4, queen d2. And now g5. And now here, this is probably the most important point of the game. Once I get this set up, my king on f1, one of the main moves here is g3. And this is always the kind of move I like to play when my opponent gets his queen to h4. And this is especially strong when my opponent has a pawn on g5. Now, the idea here is to go king g2 and open up the h-file. For example, David did take on g3 now, and now my king comes to g2. So even though I'm 2 pawns down, I'm threatening to take back on g3. Now my king is defending the g-pawn and trap my opponent's queen on h4. And this could be very tricky for black. I mean, if black takes on h2, we simply go rook takes h2, and his queen is trapped. That's not what he wants to be playing. So he really has to try to get his queen out of dodge here. And the game continued, queen to h5. I simply took on g3. And now queen g6. And even though I'm pawn down in this position, I really like white's chances here. I mean, I've always got a chance to take on g5, which I did in the game. What I probably should have done, though, was keep the queens on the board, because my opponent's king has no safe place to hide. For example, I think knight to h3 would have given me a great position here. And if something like bishop e7, the knight comes back to f2. And my knight's found a very good square. And then after something like bishop to d7, we have another typical King's Gambit move, knight to d5. And this gives white a great attacking position. So I think this is a very nice way to play. Let's show you what happened in the game. I mean, I took on g5 here with the queen, and it got very tactical. after knight takes d4, queen takes g6, pawn takes it, bishop takes g8, and knight to d5. And even here, I was actually winning a bit later on, and I kind of threw the game away, and we ended up getting a draw. But really, around this moment, some of the most interesting moments are gone. I mean, I wanted to include this game because after this game, and it's, okay, not one of the most exciting King's Gambit ideas, but I think your opponent will get queen to h4 check in a number of his games, and this has given you now a solid way to play against all of black's options. And, well, I mean, this game is still quite fascinating in this position with lots of tactics going on. I've got knight to s6 ideas, lots of pieces on pre, taking on e7 ideas. After my opponent played rook g7, I played rook to h8, and there was one moment which I'll just show you. Rook f7 was played, my knight came to f6. And around here, well, I could have done bishop to e3 here, and this would have given me a winning position. But I missed this move. The game ended in a draw, not the end of the world. But to be honest, I don't think we need to look at the rest of the game because this was really a roundup of the King's Gambit. And just to go over those main points again, this is with f4. Now, if your opponent plays the move d5, you always capture on d5. So this is rule number 1. And then against e4, you go d3. So remember that move. If your opponent takes on f4, you should now develop a knight f3. And here, because the e-file is open, I recommend you go for quick kingside castling. So you want to get your bishop out and castle kingside. This is very important in this position. If your opponent plays bishop to c5 here, you should develop both your knights, get your bishop out to c4, go d3, and try to go knight to a4. So that's very important. If your opponent takes on f4, bishop c4, and then if we play queen to h5 check at some moment in this position, h4 check, queen to h4 check, we should move our king to f1. And here, my favorite way to play is with d4, knight to c3, and then g3 and king g2 at some stage. And this gives great attacking chances for white. But yeah, that really finishes my coverage on the King's Gambit for now. Hopefully these 5 videos have given you a real nice taster of the potential of the King's Gambit. Some nice attacking ideas we've shown in these games in the King's Gambit. In my experience, it can be a deadly weapon still. Even though it's this old, romantic, fascinating opening, even nowadays, it can have devastating effect. Mainly because a lot of players playing black, after the move e5, they might have looked at lots of Rule Lopez lines with knight to f3, so they might spend all their time learning those openings. A lot of players will not actually know what to do when you play f4, so it's really good practical opening. And with the information I've given you in these 5 videos, you now have a choice after black takes on f4 of going knight to f3 or going bishop to c4. And hopefully I've given you a great tester and given you the ideas of what you should be trying to do. Do not be scared to sacrifice material. Try to build up your center, try to home in on the f7 square, and then maybe too, you could perform a little bit of Morphy magic, just like the good old days of chess when people were supposed to sacrifice their pieces, go for checkmates. And I'll tell you what, the King's Gambit is one of the most fun openings to play. Even if you lose, even if you draw, you're guaranteed to get an exciting and fun opening when playing the King's Gambit. Please tell me about how you get on the King's Gambit. I will try to look at your messages. Good luck if you give it a go. At least you're brave then. Show that you're brave. Play the King's Gambit.
invincible.